Chapter 5, GDP and Economic Growth. Gross Domestic Product, or GDP, is the primary measure of the economy's performance. It is equal to the total market value of all final goods and services produced annually within the U.S., whether by U.S. or foreign-supplied resources. In the U.S., GDP is determined by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, an agency of the Commerce Department. GDP is a monetary measure. It compares the relative value of goods and services produced in different years. To avoid counting components that are bought and sold multiple times, GDP includes only the market value of final goods and ignores intermediate goods altogether. Second-hand goods are also excluded from GDP, since they do not contribute to current production. These goods were previously counted in the year they were produced. The simplest way to measure GDP is to add up all that was spent to buy total output in a certain year. There are 4 categories of spending that are added up to obtain GDP. Personal consumption expenditures, or C, are expenditures by households for durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Gross private domestic investment, or IG, are expenditures for newly produced capital goods, such as plant and equipment, and for additions to inventories. Government purchases, or G, are government expenditures on final goods, services, and publicly owned capital. Finally, net exports, or XN, are exports minus imports. Thus, GDP can be computed as C plus IG plus G plus XN. It is difficult to compare values over time without correcting them for inflation or deflation. The monetary value of GDP changes from year to year due to changes in prices and output. To distinguish the two, economists compute nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is measured in terms of the price level at the time of measurement. In other words, GDP that is unadjusted for inflation. Real GDP is measured in terms of the price level in a base period. In other words, GDP that is adjusted for inflation. Let's consider an example of how to calculate real GDP. Suppose year 1 is a base year. Suppose in years 1 through 4 there were 5, 7, 8, and 10 units of output produced respectively. In each of these years, price per unit of output was $10, $20, $25, and $30. Thus, nominal GDP was simply units produced times price per unit, $50, $140, $200, and $300. To compute real GDP, we always multiply output by the price per unit in a base year. Thus, real GDP will be $50, $70, $80, and $100. Economic growth is an economic goal of government because it raises the standards of living in society and lessens the burden of scarcity. It is defined as the expansion of real GDP, or real GDP per capita, over time. 2 fundamental ways society can increase its real output and income are by increasing its inputs of resources and by increasing the productivity of those inputs. This table presents economic growth in the U.S. since 1950. In 1950, real GDP per capita, measured in year 2000 dollars, that is, year 2000 is a base year, was $11,666. This number more than tripled by 2000 to become $36,769. As of 2007, it was $38,174. What are the determinants of economic growth? There are 6 main ingredients. The first 4 are supply factors: increases in the quantity and quality of natural resources, increases in the quantity and quality of human resources, increases in the supply or stock of capital goods, improvements in technology. There is also a demand factor. Households, businesses, and government must purchase the expanding output, and an efficiency factor. The economy must achieve economic efficiency and full employment. Recall the production possibilities model from Chapter 1. Suppose economy is initially in point A on the production possibilities curve. Economic growth allows the economy to move to point B, which lies on a higher production possibilities curve. Thus, we can think of economic growth as an expansion of production possibilities. Growth accounting measures the relative importance of supply factors contributing to growth. Two main factors can be identified: increases in hours of work, which is a small factor in the U.S., and increases in labor productivity. Labor productivity may increase due to technological advance, which contributes 40% to productivity growth in the U.S., quantity of capital, 30% of productivity growth, education and training, 15% of productivity growth, and economies of scale and resource allocation, 15% of productivity growth. Labor productivity in the U.S. has accelerated since the 1990s. One can see that the trend rate of increase in productivity increased in the mid-1990s compared to prior years. What were the reasons? The following are the main reasons for recent productivity acceleration in the U.S. Introduction of microchip and information technology. A larger number of new startup firms. Increasing returns allow for output to increase by a larger percentage than inputs. And global competition. The main reasons for achieving increasing returns are more specialized inputs, the spreading of development costs, simultaneous consumption, network effects, and learning by doing. Is accelerated productivity growth sustainable? Is economic growth desirable and sustainable? There are two competing views. The anti-growth view states that growth has negative impacts, such as environmental problems and resource depletion, that there is no evidence that growth solved sociological problems, such as poverty, that economic wealth is not identical to a good life, and that fast economic growth is not sustainable, and slow sustainable growth would be better. In defense of economic growth, the following arguments are brought up. Growth increases the standard of living. It is the only way to resolve the problem of poverty. Growth improved working conditions, and human imagination can solve environmental and resource issues, and therefore growth can be sustainable. What were the sources of recent economic growth in China? The Chinese economy grew on average 9% and 8% per capita in the last 25 years. This impressive growth can be attributed to labor becoming more productive, an increase in international trade, transition to a market economy, and joining WTO in 2001. Two main challenges remain. The financial system in China remains weak, and income inequality across geographic areas of China is growing.